So for the next original versus remake, I wanted to talk about the Suspiria movies, the Dario Argento original and Luca Guadagnino's somewhat remake from 2018. I imagine some people might have problems with this even being a whole original versus remake thing, because a lot of people think that Guadagnino's is different enough that it's not even really considered a remake. And I can kind of get that, but I also think they have a lot more in common than I think are given credit for. But with that being said, I do think I want to talk about them instead of going back and forth and saying like what this one does versus how this one does that thing. I get they are different enough that I think it would be easier to talk about one at length and then talk about the other at length, and the comparisons will kind of just speak for themselves as they go. So hopefully everybody's cool with that. Also, I don't really want to go much down the rabbit holes of like the themes and the metaphors and stuff like that with like motherhood and power and all that. What I'm more focusing on, I think, is the sort of visceral emotions that these evoke and kind of the technical marvels that they are. So that's kind of how I wanted to go into this one a little differently than we usually do the original versus remake thing. So hopefully everybody's up for that. So to start with Argento's movie, I do think this is like the sort of gateway Argento movie. I feel like a lot of people's first Argento movie is this. It was certainly mine. And going into this one, it does basically give you everything you could possibly expect in his filmography, starting with this really intimidating opening music, the Goblin music, that he did collaborate on with them as well. And just this opening scene alone, when she's leaving the airport, already feels like there's something closing in before anything has even really happened. And it's like the focus on the storm and just the doors opening, like the mechanism with the doors opening. And then you can say right away the biggest difference that these two have, I think, of all the things, I would say the biggest difference between these two is Argento's movie's use of color, basically being one of the big parts of its entire personality. And it's like just when she's going from the airport to the academy, you see just these lights are hitting, and this is such a sort of foreshadowing and also foreboding thing going on where these lights that seem to constantly and possibly be coming from all places seem to be kind of telling their own story just visually and setting each mood with every individual scene, because I don't think there's a scene without some sort of like the only thing I can think of is maybe the dog scene is kind of in the dark, but everything else, especially when we're at the academy, just everything is bathed in some sort of light. And even that, when you talk about the color of the building itself, the red, feels like we're kind of coming in from the night, and in this dark and stormy night, you just see this very confronting red. And that's another thing that's just this really foreboding thing of where we're going, because once she's inside, we see, just the interior when she first gets in there. It's like the entranceway to hell or something, is what it looks like. And when you it doesn't really matter what's happening in the scene. Like, the scene after she faints and she wakes up in that room, there's like four different colors kind of going on at once. Or there's like the blue velvety walls. There's even moments where you would think it would they would do it in a bit more of a muted way when something's happening, like when the maggots start happening. But then even when the maggots start happening, when Miss Tanner goes out into the hallway, we're just immediately bombarded with those colors again. And when I say bombarded, I mean that in the most positive way possible. And just, it's insane how much a movie so sinister just visually pops in this way. And it's almost like a candy-colored movie. We're in like this candy-colored hell of sorts throughout all this, while increasingly horrific things are happening. Especially when the red kicks in. I feel like that's something that is also like, we see a lot of blue and we see a lot of green and a lot of yellow, but then those colors are soft enough in their sense that when we're hit with red is always really confronting, and we know something really terrible is probably going to happen, or we're building up to something. one of the terrible things happens pretty much right away when we see Pat run out of the building. And I like the fact that we're basically, with Pat coming out and Susie going in, it's like we're seeing the end of Pat's movie as Susie's is starting. And then when we follow Pat, it's when she's running through the woods, it's basically like this dream of you're just kind of stranded in the woods, and like I said, that music is just pounding over. There's like this ghostly howling going on, and you can hear the word witch being said, but in the moment you're not quite sure if you're hearing what you think you're hearing. And there's just something so like naturally supernatural about that, and like where you really feel like you're surrounded by the evil energy that's coming out of this movie just by watching it. And then when we get this whole famous sequence, maybe the most famous sequence of the movie, when Pat is killed and she's just relentlessly stabbed, and leading to her iconic hanging, which has been just referenced in several movies at this point. It's this iconic image in horror. When you see, like, when you open like any horror book or anything like that, that'll be an image that you probably see. And so opening the movie like that, where we are kind of combining this clearly supernatural element with what also feels like kind of a slasher movie, and combining these two elements. And this is something that this movie does so brilliantly, is it takes the two different sort of subgenres of horror, like witches and the supernatural, and the serial killer slasher movie, and it's basically the top form of both of those happening at the same time in the same movie. And that's just really thrilling. There's a reason this is like one of the iconic horror movies, and anytime you hear like, you know, movies like the Scream movies or something will reference an Argento fanboy or something, this will be one of the first movies that's always brought up. So all of this really stands out. And then when we start meeting the characters as Susie's sort of settling in or attempting to settle in, there's just something off about practically everybody. We have some innocent characters here that we know are going to be the characters that probably end up finding out too much and lead us to our big kill scenes. But everybody else that's just sort of going through the maze and in and out of this story, we have Miss Tanner, who's just immediately unsettling, and she has that smile that's like, her smile is like her entire face is being pulled back, and it's just really, any time she shows up, there's just this feeling of, it's almost like you're being watched by something and you're not sure if it's her or not. But just something sinister follows her around, and it's incredible. And then we've got Pavlos, the guy with the false teeth, who should be just, you know, a harmless character that comes in and out and does his job. But just the looks and the teeth and the combination of the two, there's something on it. He's like a character you would expect to see in like an old haunted house in like a 50s or 60s horror movie or something. And that's fantastic. And you've got that creepy lady that I think is her, and that creepy kid are pretty much silent throughout their screen time, and they just kind of linger around or loom around. There's the moment when she's in the hallway, and there's just something about the way she's looking and like the shiny blade. And what's great about this that's also common throughout the movie is things being scary in this movie before we even have a reason to be scared of them. Like, there's just something about it that's off enough that it gives off the vibe that, you know, like, you feel the same way as if you know what's scary about it, but there are times where you have no idea, but you still have that feeling of, I'm really scared of this thing, even though I have no reason to be. And that's something that's really strong throughout this also. And eventually we get to that point to where it's basically just one extremely memorable scene after the other. For me, it's the scene after the maggots where they have to sleep in the studio. And what I love about this is even before we get to the actual creepiness of the scene, when they're just setting up the studio to be slept in, and we see the white sheets hanging, it's like they're like shrouds, like there's already something off about this. And then when we get to this moment where everything goes red, and the directress comes in and lays behind the sheet and does that creepy, like, whistle labored snoring, and we're hearing the story about the director and who she is, supposedly. And this was the scene I remember when I first saw this movie. And I saw this at kind of a young age, too, where I wasn't really able to appreciate a lot of the more artful stuff. And here, this was when I felt hooked on this movie. Like, I feel like it's one of those scenes that you always remember the first time you saw it. And it's like, this was the moment where I knew I was completely drawn in and hypnotized by this movie. And I said, just the sounds that creep in throughout this also, and that feeling of, there's, like I was saying before, there's a lot of feelings of being watched by something. There's even a point in time where there's like a point of view, like from the camera's perspective, and it pushes in, and then it pushes in more, and there's just something so, you just feel like you're surrounded by something, just like something thick in the air that you can't quite describe. And you know that that's how Sue is feeling in every moment, and the way that's able to come off the screen and surround you is really, it's really insane that somebody can pull that off, but Argento absolutely can. And then, of course, we get a couple of our big kill scenes, like we mentioned the dog scene earlier, and this sort of, there's something I feel like really classic about this scene, but also as far as coming into the 70s when things were really starting to get hardcore. So we've got something that feels as old-fashioned as like seeing these shadows on the walls of the building of something flying around, and that kind of gives you this old-fashioned vibe of horror. And then you add in the gore of the dog ripping his throat out. It's like there's a beautiful combination of the old and the new coming in here to create something that I imagine was pretty mind-blowing in the 70s at the time, especially being so graphic and in your face. Because like one of the things we didn't even mention was during Pat's death scene, when we get the close-up of the exposed heart being stabbed. It's like, this is really insane shit. And it's crazy how we actually have stuff now that might make this seem pretty mild by comparison, but I still think this is some pretty hard-hitting stuff when we see it, even especially in the context of everything else around it. It's able to really stand that test of time, regardless of how more advanced we can get with gore now. But on the other side, we've got the Sarah situation, where she's being stalked. And once again, this is when it takes us right back into that sort of really at least for, fans like me, that really beloved place of just the standard slasher serial killer thing, where it's somebody being chased around by a knife-wielding killer. And it seems like, because there's the great moment of tension where she's behind the door and the knife comes through and is starting to unlock it, and she has really, the only thing she can do is just freeze in terror, because it's like, where do you go from here? But then we have that moment of relief where it looks like there's an escape through this window or entryway of sorts, and then it's the surprise barbed wire room. And just seeing her trapped in that barbed wire, you really, like, we're not even really seeing a lot. We're just seeing her in what could just look like regular wire, but because we know what it is and we know the context, there's just, it actually becomes hard to watch, even though we're not really seeing much gore-wise. Just the terror of it is there. And the sound kind of creeping in also certainly helps that also. I also love more color here, where when this scene first starts with Sarah and the terror is really starting to rise, and she can't get Susie to wake up and she feels stranded, like she feels alone now, and everything's bathed in green. And it's like, when the terror starts to rise, you think like, well, green's not really this particularly doomy color. And then she opens the door, and the second she opens the door, then the room is bathed in red. And it's basically telling us her fate immediately. And that's just really beautifully done. And then in talking about the classic feel of it, these scenes that are pretty standard and might even be seen as cliches are something that's really welcome. And it's like, I have like such affection for, like how when we're getting into the supernatural and then Udo Kier comes in to give us like an info dump. It's like, even when it's like this cliche info dump, it still just feels like it's so much in the identity of the supernatural horror genre that just like everything, whether it's cliche or whatever, is welcome and really just puts you right in that mood and that vibe. And this pretty much takes us into the climax, as the information dump often does. And what I love about this is when she's piecing together this secret compartment that they're in, and the way that it's almost, before we really know what's going on and before she really knows what's going on, it's almost like she has to think with dream logic in order to figure out what's going on here. I really love that. And then this whole thing of stumbling onto something. I love how much she sees without, before they know that she's there. Because this idea of just stumbling onto something that not only you know you're not supposed to see and hear, but is specifically targeting you for death. And it's like that area here where she knows and can hear them, but they don't know it yet that she's there, is this really, really tense moment. And maybe even more tense when they do realize she's there, and then we get our big climax, this big confrontation. And we finally get all this build up to Marcos, who is still behind the curtains, and we can still only identify by the breathing. And then I love the idea of an antagonist that stays pretty much unseen the whole time. Where when she pulls the curtain back and then we can still hear her, but she's not there, is this amazing rush of terror, and then this sadistic idea to materialize through Sarah's reanimated body that's in the process of decomposition and has the crazy eyes. And then ultimately, finally, we do reveal a form of Marcos for this final confrontation, and it's... And the way there's like no fat on this movie, because as soon as this confrontation ends, the movie just stops. And she's able to just walk away from it. And yeah, so it's basically a monster movie by the end of it. And so to take all these different genres and put them together into this one just incredible experience of all angles of classic horror is, you can just really see why this is the classic that it is, and it's like a gateway for people and a go-to for people. And when you look at Guadagnino's movie, obviously we are dealing with something that has so much of these elements, but is also just a different experience entirely. So you'll notice today, Guadagnino's movie is being represented here by a graphic. It's unfortunately hard to get a hold of physically, but I'm hoping to at some point. You'll notice I've still got this very old, nostalgic DVD of Suspiria that I feel like I've had forever. But to talk about Guadagnino's movie now, we are promised at the very start that this story is going to be told to us through 6 acts and an epilogue. And it's then this German autumn setting, which is a real setting. So we kind of got this grounded feel right away, but you'll notice the first big difference right away when we're introduced to Pat, who's now played by Chloe Moretz. And in Argento's movie, it's kind of, we gradually find out with Susie what's going on here with the witches and everything that's going on, and this mystery of what it was that Pat said when she ran out. Here, we just immediately, Pat tells us everything and lays everything out by talking to her doctor about everything that's happened here. Her doctor, who is played by Tilda Swinton in extremely heavy makeup and playing a male character. And I really love, just one of the many things to love about Tilda Swinton is there was a lot of, why does Tilda Swinton play so many parts in this, and why play this doctor in particular? And to my understanding, Tilda Swinton's answer to that was just for fun. So just approaching it like that, and her reuniting with Guadagnino after I Am Love, there's just, it's dark and harrowing as this whole movie is. It is nice to see that there was this sort of level of play going on as far as the making of it, and the fact that people seem to be having fun just going into it, and sometimes just for the sake of it. So that kind of adds some nice sort of behind-the-scenes levity to the content of the actual movie. But yeah, we get this opening scene where Pat's telling us everything, and she seems quite manic, and if we didn't know what was going on, we would probably think that she sounds crazy also, despite the fact that we do get a clue going in here where we do hear this disembodied whispering, where it does feel like she was kind of followed here. And so immediately that brings in very familiar vibes from the original movie while being something totally different and presenting itself in a totally different way. So then we get to the train station and the arrival of Susie, who's now played by Dakota Johnson, and keep seeing flashes of her dying mother, and I love how the soundtrack to this scene when she's arriving is like these dying breaths of her mother as it goes into it. Again, sort of playing into those themes that it gets into along the way. But as far as this audition scene that really opens us up, and we do have, again, similar introduction where she comes in and just the architecture of the place feels like we're entering another world entirely. Even though it was a point, we were talking about one of the biggest differences being the colors in this, how there was an intentional absence of color given to the production design and everything in this. And like, a lot of it especially is in like the mirrors. And so there's just this sort of sterile feel to it that interestingly enough, the way this tells the story also feels just as appropriate as all of the bursting colors did in the original movie, which is really fascinating. And then we get the audition scene itself, and just immediately you get these horrible vibes of when she comes out. It's like she's being offered up to something sinister, like there's something predatory going on. And then props to Dakota Johnson for the physicality in this particular performance, because when she dances, it is like somebody possessed. And there's already like this underlying insanity to what's going on, when again, nothing is really happening. What we talked about in the original movie, where it's like, when you don't have anything in particular to pinpoint is particularly scary or going down a dark path, there's just something in the air that feels like everything is off and there's some sort of hell that's coming through or underlying. Actually getting the imagery of Marcus's hands under the floor, and like even before we see that, just everything is already here just in the feeling of everything. And that even stuff that's thrown in that just feels really, I don't know, like when you have Mia Goth playing Sarah, and you have the moment where she's just kind of walking in figures and pacing in figures, and there's just something unnatural about these things. Like there's a moment where they're talking about Marcus, and they're on the couch, two of the mothers, and the way they're sitting on the couch and the way they're facing feels like they're not, like, there's just something, just everything feels so unnatural. And, like, am I even seeing what I'm seeing correctly? Or is something being altered here? And it's a really wild feeling. And when you get into the more, because obviously one of the more famous things about the original movie is the gore, when it like really goes into the horror and the kills. And so you have this scene, this pretty instantly famous scene with Olga, and the way that it keeps going, Olga's fate is what we're talking about. This scene that goes on and on and on. And the thing about it is I keep wanting to call it Olga's death scene, but probably the most sadistic part of this whole thing, where Susie's dancing, is contorting her in the other room and like crushing her body in the process. The most sadistic thing about this is that you can't call it a death scene because it's not. It seems a lot like a death scene. We've got those horrific hooks. Just the imagery of the hooks alone is something that probably stands out even more than any horror image we might see in the original movie. And that's just something that like really gets under my skin every time I see them. And they return often. And yeah, the fact that this isn't even a death scene is just mind-blowingly sadistic. And what I love about this also is something that can be really overused is the dream sequence. It's like one of my least favorite things in any sort of media, because oftentimes it's just there for a cheap scare, and it doesn't really amount to much of anything. It feels like filler, like we're killing time, because they ultimately usually mean nothing anyway. So here, these nightmare sequences, they're not just freaky. They when I watch these nightmare sequences in this movie, I feel like I want to get up and leave the room. Like they're like they could just be scary or they could just be freaky. They are anxiety inducing. And you don't know what you're looking at, and you don't know what the next image is that you're going to see, and it gets like more horrific and more gruesome, but also more mysterious, and just everything about this, the uncertainty of what you're even looking at, and what that evokes, I feel like, is what many have tried to do with nightmare sequences and dream sequences, but they ultimately just end up feeling pointless or like cheap scares. This feels like something else entirely, just the nightmare sequences alone. So I really appreciate when something like that can actually be done really well and to its fullest effect. And then we get these moments of tension where we get like the dance instruction, where it's exactly what it feels like. It feels like they're being prepped for a ritual, which is what's going on. And the fact that you can, even when you don't know that right up front, it's just oozing out of the screen of this. They're being prepped for something horrific and nightmarish. But then there's when we had the scene earlier where there's a severe injury, and so any time the jumping is happening now, there's this anxiety that comes with the anticipation of any sort of injury, kind of is what takes over these dancing scenes. And we're building it up just enough to work that into where any time, because they've been dancing the whole movie, there's been dance sequences the whole movie, and then there's this turning point after this injury where every scene following that just has you on the edge of your seat, but also wanting to look away because you never know when something like that's going to happen again. And then we get to the actual recital dance scene, which is appropriately hypnotic. And it's at this point when we go underneath everything, and it pays off all of these promises of insanity that have been coming our way in like this last 45 minutes or so. We have, and this is another one. We talked a lot about the sound in the original movie. This one also, whether it be like echoes or constant rain in the background or bone crunching in particular, this is something that really stands out here. And this moment where Mia Goth is brought out to dance on this mangled leg, and it's gruesome and it's hard to look at, but what I love about this and I love about Mia Goth's performance is that her screams of pain and horror are even worse than the gore. they're even more traumatizing in the scene. Like, that's the thing that you carry with you for the remainder of the scenes afterwards, is the sound of her screaming rather than what you just saw. Even though what you just saw is also quite horrific in its own right. And what I love about this also is when we get into this last insane 45 minutes or so, in this kind of unexpected way, even though we've been building it up with this parallel story going on with the Doctor, the way in between these moments we have this tenderness where they actually bring back Harper, the original actress, to play his long-lost wife, and they have these genuinely tender scenes, and while they are leading to, him being trapped and taken to the climax of the movie and put in this horrific situation, there's still like a genuine tenderness here, and I like the fact that by the time we get to the end, they don't leave it behind. So it does feel like it's not just there for the fake out or to lure us in. Like, these are really genuine moments between these two characters that are really important to what's going on here. And we'll get more into that with the epilogue, but getting into these final moments, this insane final climax, because we talked about how kind of quickly the climax of the original movie happens, but here, when Susie reveals herself as Mother Suspiriorum, obviously another one of the, I talked about the colors, yeah, that's another one of the biggest possible changes that can happen, but when we get to this moment where everything is coming to its climax, you've got Tilda Swinton playing all three characters at the same time in one scene. Three completely different characters with three completely different appearances. And like Marcos will fill anybody's nightmares as soon as they've seen this. But everything else that happens here, when the reveal happens and everybody pays their price in the fashion that they deserve. And we go into what I guess I can only call operatic gore, where everybody's exploding, and there's like a scariness, but there's also a gentleness where the people that need horrific fates are meeting horrific fates, and then there's like Pat and Olga and Sarah who get these little silent mercy kills. And watching this happen, this whole sequence where everything is covered in red and blood, and it's like the lights in the original movie, but it's the blood in the room has made everything red, turned everything red. And it's gruesome, and it's surreal, and it's tragic, but it's satisfying, it's weirdly euphoric. And like it's a climax that you have to experience to believe that you're actually seeing this. And even then, even you might not even believe your eyes. And like just all the different emotions are all happening at once, and it's all leading to this. Well, I feel like it's appropriate to the movie to say one might describe it as orgasmic in the way that it builds up and then reaches this magnificent climax. And yeah, and then after all that carnage and all that terrifying and surreal imagery, our epilogue does bring us back to this final moment with the Doctor where he learns the truth, which is another kind of mercy showing from Mother Suspiriorum. And then the brilliant idea to have the final shot be a symbol of love. Like, that's the shot of the movie we go out on. And so there's a lot going on here. I don't think I mentioned there is a change in music where we have the very iconic Goblin score. In this, we have Tom York kind of evoking, like, I think the plan was to evoke like German rock from the 70s. Even the subtitles have some visual flair where most of the time they have like that red shadow, but then there's moments where they have like a blue shadow. I'm not even sure what the difference is supposed to be, but or what one is supposed to signify versus the other. But yeah, this is how all of this. I remember when this one first came out, and I was late to the party, so I only heard about it for a little while. I heard little murmurs about how like graphic and intense the Olga scene was and how disturbing it was. And the idea of it being this completely different monster to the original movie and being its own thing, and this climax that's like this insane, like we were talking about a movie I don't like Ready or Not or something, where everybody was talking about the exploding bodies climax and how, oh my god, it's the craziest thing ever. It's like, this was the year before that, I believe, where we had a nice big exploding body climax, and this one is significantly more effective. Not to, I hate, complimenting a movie by putting down another, but in this particular instance, I'll go ahead and do that. So, yeah, this one has all these emotions, but I love the way it's balanced out, where you can have the scares and the terrifying moments and be telling this really dark, visceral story, but actually be injecting this angle of love and lost love into it, and grieving and mourning and being able to move on. And it's, yeah, there's so much going on with this one. We could talk about it all day, but because we have so many videos this month, I think I have to end it here. But those are my sort of surface level feelings about the somewhat remake and this original movie also. So like I said, any comparisons to be made, hopefully they sort of made themselves. We'll see what's missing from this one and what this one kind of took off with, and stuff where this one maybe felt a bit more classically horror and this one goes off into a more cerebral place. And it's, yeah, there's just so much here, and the fact that you can take two movies that kind of tell the same story but give you so much between the two of them it's just really magical when this kind of thing happens, and two things like this can come together and two visions can come together like this. So that's pretty much how I feel about these. So no idea what the next thing is, but we've got a lot more stuff coming daily for the rest of the month of October, and hopefully it's been fun and will continue to be fun. So until the next thing, I think that's it.